The alarm hit before I even opened my eyes. Red light bathed my quarters, and the low groan of the ship shifting under thruster load told me something outside had gone wrong. I was Daniel Hart, medical officer aboard the UNS Ashen Vow, and in 3 years of service, I had learned that alarms before breakfast never meant good news. I pulled on my jacket and ran for the corridor, boots slapping against the deck plating. Crew moved past me in both directions, some heading to weapons stations, others to the reactor deck. Nobody looked at me. Nobody had time. "Hart!" Captain Edmund Locke's voice cut through the noise from the overhead speaker. "Medbay now. We have an incoming transport, hostile escort on our tail, and I need you ready for casualties." I did not ask questions. On the Ashen Vow, questions came after survival. The ship rocked as something struck our shields, a dull thud that traveled up through my legs. I grabbed a handhold and kept moving, weaving through crew stacking crates of supplies near the airlock. Through the reinforced viewport at the end of the corridor, I caught a glimpse of open space, and against the black, 3 alien warships pursuing a smaller, damaged vessel that limped toward us like a wounded animal. That smaller ship carried something the whole galaxy seemed to want, and somehow, my captain had decided we would be the ones to take it. By the time I reached the medical bay, my hands were already steady out of habit, laying out trauma kits and prepping the scanner bed. Grace Whitfield, our first officer, appeared in the doorway a moment later, her face calm in the way that only comes from years of pretending everything is fine when it is not. "We're bringing them aboard," she said. "1 survivor confirmed. Might be more." "From the transport? From the transport?" She hesitated, which was unlike her. "Hart, whoever this is, the captain wants them alive, stable, and quiet. No questions asked in front of the crew. You'll get the details once we're clear." That kind of order from Grace usually meant the details were bad enough that she did not want to say them twice. The Ashen Vow was not a large ship. We were a patrol vessel, built for scouting and diplomacy long before the war that made humanity infamous across a dozen star systems. People called us relics now, holdovers from a program most higher command wanted to forget. But out here, on the edge of contested space, relics were sometimes the only ones willing to take the risk nobody else wanted. "Oh." I felt the ship shudder again, harder this time, and heard Owen Pierce's voice come through engineering comms, tight and clipped. "Shields at 60%, Captain. Whatever's chasing that ship, it wants it bad." "Copy that," Locke replied. "Nora, clear me a firing line. We're not letting them take the prize before we do." Nora Sullivan, our security chief, did not answer verbally. A moment later, the whole ship rang like a bell as our forward cannons opened fire, buying seconds for the smaller vessel to close the distance. I stood in the medbay listening to my own ship fight for something I did not yet understand, and for the first time since joining the crew, I felt genuinely unsettled, not afraid of dying, afraid of what waited on that transport. The transport docked 12 minutes later, 12 minutes that felt like an hour. When the airlock hissed open, I expected wounded soldiers, or refugees, or maybe some diplomat we had rescued from a burning outpost. What came through instead made every hair on my arms rise. She was massive, easily twice my height, with a long, segmented body plated in deep violet chitin that shimmered faintly under the corridor lights. 6 limbs supported her weight, 4 of them ending in delicate, almost hand-like appendages, while her upper body rose in a more humanoid shape, crowned by a face that was unmistakably alien and unmistakably intelligent. Her eyes, dark and multifaceted, locked onto me the instant she crossed the threshold, and I swear I felt them measuring my worth in a single glance. 2 of our security officers flanked her, weapons lowered but ready, and behind her, a single attendant of her own kind, smaller and clearly injured, collapsed the moment the airlock sealed. "Medical emergency," I called out, snapping into motion. "Get the injured one on the table." The attendant's wounds were severe, deep lacerations across the lower limbs, consistent with shrapnel or debris. I worked fast, cutting away damaged chitin plating with careful precision, applying coagulant compounds Owen and I had developed months earlier after studying alien physiology from old survey logs. Blood, if you could call it that, ran a strange blue-green, and it took every ounce of training I had not to hesitate. Through all of it, she watched. The tall one, The one who had walked through that airlock like she owned the ship despite being our prisoner, guest, or whatever she was, stood perfectly still near the wall, her multiple eyes fixed on my hands as I worked. She said nothing. She did not need to. Something about her stillness radiated authority, the kind that did not need to be announced. Her name is Vesserai, Grace said quietly, stepping beside me as I finished stabilizing the attendant. That's as much as I know. Command wants her kept alive and unharmed. Beyond that, I'm as blind as you. She's not just a passenger, is she? Grace's silence answered for her. I finished treating the attendant, who I later learned went by the name Ithra, a term that seemed to function as both name and title among her kind. She would recover, given time and rest, though the trauma had clearly taken something out of her that no bandage could fix. Then I turned to Vesserai. "You're not injured?" I asked, more out of habit than expectation of an answer. Most of the alien species we had encountered over the years understood some fragment of trade language, thanks to decades of cautious contact, before things fell apart. Her head tilted, slow and deliberate, evaluating me. When she spoke, her voice came out layered, almost musical, several tones overlapping in a way that made my translator implant strain to keep up. "Physically, no," she said. "You are the one they call healer. Medical officer, Daniel Hart." "Hart," she repeated, testing the word. A strange name for a creature so feared. I blinked. Feared? Something flickered behind those dark eyes, something I could not quite name yet. Not quite fear, not quite curiosity, but close to both. "You do not know," she said, and it was not a question. "They send you into the dark not knowing what you carry with you." Before I could ask what she meant, Locke's voice barked over the comms, ordering all senior staff to the bridge. Transport secured. Hostile ships breaking off pursuit for reasons unknown. I had orders of my own, to settle our guest into secure quarters and monitor her condition, but her words stayed lodged in my mind long after the alarms finally quieted. The Ashen Vow had a habit of taking on cargo nobody explained properly, and I had learned to live with that uncertainty. But something about the way Vesserai looked at me, the way she seemed to already know things about my ship, my captain, even about me, told me this cargo was different. Later that night, once the corridors had settled into their usual hum and the emergency lighting switched back to standard white, I found myself standing outside the reinforced quarters we had converted for her use. Nora had overseen the modifications herself, strengthened walls, a larger doorway to accommodate her size, environmental controls adjusted based on whatever data we had on her species. It was, by ship standards, practically a suite. I knocked, more out of courtesy than expectation, and the door slid open at her command. She occupied the center of the room, coiled in a resting posture that reminded me of pictures I had seen of ancient sea creatures, elegant despite the alien strangeness of it. The room's lighting had been dimmed to something softer, and in that light, the violet plating across her body seemed to shift and deepen, almost like watching color move across still water. "You have questions," she said before I spoke a word. "I have a job," I replied. "Checking on your condition, that's all. Is it?" I set my scanner down without using it, choosing instead to sit on the small stool, positioned a respectful distance from her. Something told me instruments would tell me less than conversation would. "Your attendant, Ithra. She'll recover. It'll take time." "She is loyal," Vesserai said simply. "Loyalty costs more than most understand." "You said something earlier, about my ship, about us being feared." Her multifaceted eyes studied me again, and this time, I noticed something in the way her lower limbs shifted slightly, a motion I would later learn was the alien equivalent of hesitation. "Your kind ended an empire," she said. "Not through cruelty, as the stories claim, but through something far more unsettling to my people. You showed mercy where you could have shown none, and still, entire fleets broke and fled rather than face you again. My people call your species the nightmare of the void, not because of what you have done, because of what you are capable of, and choose not to do." I did not know how to respond to that. I had heard fragments of the old stories, whispers among command about an incident decades ago that shaped how much of the galaxy viewed humanity, but nothing official, nothing detailed, just enough to know the topic was one senior officers avoided discussing with junior staff. "And you," I said carefully. Why does an empire's queen end up fleeing across contested space with a single wounded attendant and 3 warships trying to kill her? For a long moment she said nothing, and I thought perhaps I had pushed too far, too quickly. Then, slowly, she uncoiled slightly, drawing herself up to a more attentive posture. Because my own people decided I was no longer useful to them, she said. And because your captain, for reasons I have not yet discovered, decided I was worth the risk of rescuing. Maybe he just doesn't like watching anyone get hunted down. Something that might have been amusement passed across her expression, subtle and quick. Perhaps heart. Or perhaps there are reasons even you have not been told. I left her quarters that night with more questions than I had walked in with, and a strange, nagging sense that whatever mission briefing Locke eventually gave the senior staff, it would only be the surface of a much deeper story. The Ashen Vow had rescued plenty of strays over the years. Refugees, defectors, the occasional smuggler running from the wrong people. But none of them had looked at me the way Vesserai did, like she already understood exactly what kind of ship, and what kind of man, she had ended up trusting her safety to. I did not sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those dark, faceted eyes studying me, weighing me, and I could not shake the feeling that somewhere in that quiet, careful gaze, something had already begun to shift, something neither of us fully understood yet. By morning, the ship had returned to its usual rhythm, engines humming steady, crew moving through familiar routines, as if the chaos of the previous night had simply been another Tuesday in deep space. But as I made my way to the bridge for the senior staff briefing Locke had promised, I passed by the reinforced door to Vesserai's quarters, and felt, for just a moment, the strange sensation of being watched from behind sealed walls. Whatever the captain was about to tell us, I already suspected it would not explain everything. Some things, I was beginning to realize, you only understood by getting close enough to the danger to feel its breath on your neck. And I had a feeling I was about to get very close indeed. The briefing room fell silent the moment Captain Locke stepped through the door, a data slate in one hand and a look on his face that told me he had not slept either. What we rescued last night, he began, without preamble, is Vesserai, former sovereign of the Convergence, a hive empire that controlled 6 systems along the Outer Rim until roughly 2 years ago. Her people call her deposed. Her enemies call her a war criminal. Command calls her an asset. Grace Whitfield leaned forward. And what do you call her, Captain? Locke's jaw tightened. Someone who might know things that could keep this ship, and a lot of other ships, from getting caught in a war none of us want. Owen Pierce, still smelling faintly of engine coolant from a double shift, raised a hand. With respect, sir, if she's a deposed empress running from her own people, why were 3 warships trying to kill her instead of capture her? You don't waste firepower like that on someone you want alive for questioning. Because they didn't want her captured, Locke said. They wanted her gone, permanently. Someone in her own court decided a dead queen was safer than a living one who might talk. I sat quietly through most of it, absorbing details that painted a picture very different from the cold, imperious figure I had spoken with the night before. According to the briefing, the Convergence had once been among the most aggressive hive empires bordering human space, responsible for the near destruction of an early colony world decades ago, an event that had scarred both species and fed directly into the fear that still followed humanity across the stars. So she's connected to what happened at Meridian Colony, I said, the pieces falling into place. Locke nodded grimly. Her predecessor ordered the attack. She inherited the throne years later, inherited the blame along with it, whether she deserved it or not. And now her own empire wants her dead to bury the evidence, Nora Sullivan added, arms crossed. Convenient. Command wants her alive, Locke said. Alive, cooperative, and eventually delivered somewhere safe enough that she can testify about the internal collapse of the Convergence. That intelligence could prevent an entire new conflict from breaking out along the rim. I thought about Vesserai's words from the night before, about loyalty costing more than most understood, about her own people deciding she was no longer useful. It all fit together with a precision that made my chest tighten uncomfortably. There's something else, Grace said, tapping her own data slate. Long-range scans picked up chatter before the attack. Multiple factions converging on this sector, not just the ones that attacked her transport. If word gets out that we have her aboard, we're not just dealing with one hostile faction anymore. How long before that word gets out? I asked. Assume it already has, Locke said, which means our job now is threefold. Keep her alive, keep her stable, and keep this ship in one piece long enough to reach a friendly outpost where higher command can take her off our hands. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, covering patrol routes, defensive postures, and contingency plans, should we be intercepted again. Through all of it, my mind kept drifting back to the medical bay, to Ithra's wounds, to the strange musical layering of Vesserai's voice, to the unsettling accuracy with which she seemed to already understand things about my ship and my captain that no briefing had covered. When the meeting broke up, Locke caught my arm before I could leave. Hart, you're her primary contact going forward. Medical necessity gives you access. Nobody else gets, without an armed escort. I need you keeping her calm, keeping her healthy, and keeping your ears open for anything useful she lets slip. You want me to interrogate a patient, sir? I want you to be a decent human being to someone who probably hasn't experienced much of that lately, Locke said, softer than I expected. The information will come on its own if we treat her like a person instead of a prize. It struck me, walking away from that conversation, that Locke understood something about this situation that the rest of the briefing had danced around. Whatever the Convergence had done to earn its reputation, whatever crimes lay at Vesserai's feet by inheritance rather than action, my captain seemed genuinely uncertain whether she was a villain deserving suspicion or a victim deserving protection. Perhaps, I thought, she was both. Perhaps most people caught in the machinery of empire and war usually were. I found Ithra awake when I returned to the medical bay, propped up against the reinforced bedding we had improvised from cargo netting and thermal padding. Her injuries were healing well, faster than human tissue would have managed under similar trauma, and her eyes, smaller and less faceted than her queen's, tracked me carefully as I checked her vitals. You saved my life, she said, her translated voice thin but clear. I have not thanked you properly. You don't need to thank me. It's my job. Among my people, healing is never simply a job. It is a bond. She paused, studying me, with an intensity that reminded me uncomfortably of Vesserai the night before. You do not understand what you have already begun, heart of the healing hands. Begun what, exactly? Ithra's antennae, delicate feathered structures I had not noticed clearly until now, twitched in what I interpreted as hesitation. It is not my place to speak of the Queen's private matters. But know this, she has not allowed a stranger this close to her in a very long time, not since before the collapse. She barely tolerates me being in the room. She watches you when you are not looking, Ithra said simply. That is not tolerance, Hart. That is something else entirely. I did not know what to make of that comment then, though I would think back on it many times in the days that followed. At the time, I dismissed it as the exhausted rambling of an injured woman still processing trauma, grateful to the person who had stitched her back together. It seemed easier to believe that than the alternative. Over the following days, my visits to Vesserai's quarters became a fixture of my daily routine, ostensibly for medical monitoring, though our conversations rarely stayed confined to biology and vital signs. She spoke, slowly at first and then with increasing openness, about the Convergence, about the hive structure that bound millions of individuals into a single functioning empire, about the peculiar isolation of standing at the top of that structure while never truly belonging to the collective mind that sustained it. You were never part of the hive mind yourself? I asked one evening, adjusting environmental controls to compensate for a slight temperature fluctuation her biology seemed sensitive to. Queens exist apart, she explained. We direct the collective without being consumed by it. It is, in its own way, a profound loneliness few outside my species understand. Sounds a lot like command, I said. My captain carries the weight of every decision alone, even surrounded by a full crew. Her eyes settled on me with an intensity that made my translator implant seem almost unnecessary, as if I could read her thoughts directly from the shift in her posture. Perhaps that is why your captain chose to save me, recognizing a burden he understands intimately. I found myself, more often than I expected, looking forward to these conversations. There was an unexpected depth to her perspective, a queen who had inherited both a throne and a war she never chose. forced to navigate politics that made human bureaucracy look simple by comparison. She asked me questions in turn, about my life before the Ashen Vow, about why a species capable of such devastating restraint chose to spend its energy on healing rather than conquest. Not every human wants war, I told her one night. Most of us just want to go home in one piece. And yet you serve on a ship the galaxy fears, she said. A ship that carries the same restraint my people mistake for weakness, and the same capability my people call nightmare. Maybe restraint looks like weakness right up until it doesn't. Something shifted in her expression then, subtle enough that I almost missed it, a softening around her mandibles that I had come to associate with something like genuine consideration, rather than the calculated evaluation she usually offered. You are unlike the others aboard this ship, she said quietly. They fear what I represent. You simply see a patient. Should I be afraid of what you represent? Perhaps, she admitted. But you are not, and that troubles me more than if you were. I did not understand what she meant by that then, though the words settled somewhere in my chest and stayed there, quiet and persistent, long after I left her quarters that night. Word of our unusual passenger had, predictably, spread through the ship despite official efforts at discretion. Crew members whispered theories in the mess hall, ranging from wild speculation about her being a spy, sent to gather intelligence on human technology, to more grounded concerns about what would happen if the factions hunting her located our position again. Nora Sullivan, ever practical, doubled security rotations near the medical bay and Vesserized quarters without waiting for official orders, a decision Locke quietly approved without comment. You're spending a lot of time with her, Grace observed one afternoon, catching me on my way back from another check-in. More than medical monitoring requires. She's a complicated patient, I said, perhaps too quickly. Grace studied me, with the same careful assessment she gave every tactical situation, and I got the distinct impression she saw straight through my deflection. Just be careful, Hart! Whatever she is to her own people, whatever she becomes to command once we hand her off, right now she's cargo the entire sector wants dead or captured. Getting attached to cargo like that rarely ends well for the person doing the attaching. I told her she had nothing to worry about, that I understood the stakes, that professional distance remained fully intact. I told myself the same thing more times than I care to admit over the following days, each time with slightly less conviction, as the quiet evenings in that dimly lit room began to feel less like duty and more like something I found myself anticipating despite every instinct telling me I should not. The Convergence's remaining loyalists were not idle during this time, however, and reports from our long-range sensors painted an increasingly troubling picture. Multiple vessels, some bearing the Convergence's distinctive violet insignia and others flying flags we did not immediately recognize, had begun converging toward our projected patrol route, their movements too coordinated to be coincidental. They know where we're headed, Nora reported during an emergency briefing 3 days after the rescue. Someone leaked our flight plan, or they've got better tracking capability than we accounted for. Can we alter course without losing too much time? Locke asked. We can, Owen replied, but every alternate route adds risk of its own. Uncharted debris fields, unstable jump corridors, territory we don't have good intelligence on. Locke weighed the options in silence for a long moment, the kind of silence that had become familiar aboard the Ashen Vow, whenever a decision carried consequences beyond the immediate crew. Alter course, he finally said. Better an unknown risk than a known one, bearing down on us with warships. As the ship shifted trajectory, I made my way back to Vesserized quarters, uncertain whether to share the news or simply monitor her reaction to the subtle change in the ship's gravitational rhythm that always accompanied a course correction. She noticed immediately, of course. Queens, it seemed, noticed everything. They are closer than your captain wants to admit, she said before I could speak. How do you know that? Because I know my own people, she said, something heavy settling into her voice. And because I know what desperation does to those who believe they have already lost everything worth protecting. I sat with her longer than I intended that evening, listening as she spoke, for the first time, about the weight of watching her empire fracture from within, about the isolation of ruling a collective mind that ultimately decided she was expendable, about the strange, unexpected comfort she had found in the company of a species her people had spent generations fearing. By the time I finally left her quarters that night, the corridors dark and quiet under the ship's simulated night cycle, I understood with growing certainty that whatever Locke had assigned me to do, whatever careful distance Grace had warned me to maintain, something had already shifted between the alien queen and myself, that no briefing, no protocol, and no amount of professional caution was going to be able to fully contain. The Ashen Vow continued its altered course through the dark, carrying its impossible cargo and its uncertain future forward, one quiet conversation at a time. 3 days after the course change, an alarm woke me at an hour the ship's clock insisted was still deep night, and my first thought, groggy and half-formed, was that the factions hunting us had finally caught up. I was wrong. It was worse, in its own quiet way. "Medical emergency," Nora's voice crackled through my cabin speaker. "Get to her quarters, Hart. Something's wrong with the Queen." I ran the length of the corridor in less time than I thought my legs were capable of, scanner bag banging against my hip, and found 2 security officers already stationed outside Vesserai's door, tension written across both their faces. "She started making sounds," one of them explained as I pushed past. "Some kind of distress call. We didn't want to enter without you." Inside, I found her curled tightly in on herself. Her usually elegant posture collapsed into something smaller, more vulnerable, her multiple limbs drawn close against her body in a way I had never seen before. The sounds she made were unlike anything from our previous conversations, layered and mournful, closer to song than speech. "Vesserai," I said, kneeling beside her, scanner already active. "Talk to me. What's happening?" Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then sharpening, as recognition set in. "Heart," she managed, the word strained. "It is nothing physical. You cannot heal this with instruments." "Then help me understand what I'm looking at." She was quiet for a long moment, her breathing, if that was the correct term for the process her biology used, slowly evening out. "The hive mind," she finally said. "Even in exile, even severed from direct command, a queen retains a distant connection to those who once served her. I felt several of them die tonight, executed, likely, for failing to eliminate me." The weight of that statement settled over the room like a physical presence. I had read about hive mind connections in the mission briefings, abstract concepts discussed in clinical, detached language, but nothing had prepared me for witnessing the raw grief of someone experiencing the loss of individuals she had never physically met, connected only through a biological bond most humans could not begin to comprehend. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it more than the words probably conveyed. "You need not apologize for crimes you did not commit," she said, though something in her tone suggested she appreciated the sentiment regardless. I stayed with her far longer than protocol required that night, monitoring her vitals long after they had stabilized, simply because leaving felt wrong, in a way I could not fully articulate. She spoke, in fragments interrupted by long silences, about the individuals she had felt die, about their names, their functions within the collective, small details that painted them as people, rather than abstract casualties of a war being fought largely without her direct involvement. "You cared for them," I said at one point, "even from here, even in exile. A queen cares for her hive as instinctively as your heart beats," she said. "It is not a choice, it simply is." Somewhere in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, sitting beside her in that dimly lit room while the rest of the ship slept, I realized something had fundamentally changed in how I saw her. She was no longer simply a diplomatic asset, a source of intelligence, or even a complicated patient requiring careful management. She was, plainly and simply, someone grieving, someone carrying weight I could only partially understand, and someone who had, against every instinct her species and mine had cultivated toward each other, chosen to let me witness that grief. "Why me?" I asked eventually, unable to hold the question back any longer. "Ithra said you don't let strangers this close. Why let me see this?" Her eyes found mine, steady, despite the exhaustion evident in every line of her posture. "Because you never once looked at me as something to fear or something to exploit," she said. "You looked at me the way you would look at anyone in pain. That is rarer than you understand, Hart, and rarer still across the vast distance between our two species." I did not have a good response to that, so I simply stayed, offering the only thing I genuinely had to give, my presence and my attention, until exhaustion finally pulled her into something resembling rest. The following days brought a subtle but noticeable shift in Vesserai's demeanor. The cold, calculating queen who had first walked through our airlock had not disappeared entirely. That political sharpness remained essential to who she was, but something softer had emerged alongside it, visible in small moments that I found myself cataloging with an attention that probably should have concerned me more than it did. She began asking about my life more directly, about my family back on Earth, about what drew me to medicine rather than combat roles more typical for someone serving aboard a patrol vessel like the Ashen Vow. My mother was a physician, I told her during one such conversation. I grew up watching her patch people back together after the worst days of their lives. Seemed like a better use of my time than learning how to break people apart. An unusual philosophy for a species. Your galaxy fears as much as mine feared yours. Most of us didn't choose the reputation, I said. We just choose what we do with the time we've got out here. She considered that for a long moment, her lower limbs shifting in the subtle gesture I had come to recognize as thoughtful consideration. Among my people, a queen's worth is measured entirely by the strength and size of her hive. Individual choice, individual philosophy, these concepts hold little weight in convergent society. And yet here I am, deposed, exiled, stripped of everything that once defined my worth, and I find myself more curious about your individual choices than I have been about anything in years. That sounds almost like a compliment. Perhaps it is, she said, something that might have been the alien equivalent of a smile touching the edges of her mandibles. Word of these extended conversations inevitably reached Grace, who cornered me in the mess hall one evening, with the particular expression she reserved for conversations she considered overdue. You're spending 3-4 hours some nights in there, she said, sliding into the seat across from me without invitation. That's not medical monitoring anymore, Hart. That's something else. She lost people, I said. People connected to her mind, in ways we don't fully understand. She needed someone to talk to. And it has to be you specifically? I did not have a good answer for that, and Grace's expression told me she recognized the silence for what it was. Look, she said, softer now. I'm not judging you for being decent to someone going through something difficult. But you need to understand what you're walking into here. She's not just an alien patient with an interesting personality. She's the deposed ruler of an empire that once tried to wipe out an entire human colony. Command wants her testimony, wants her intelligence, and the moment she's given both, she becomes someone else's problem entirely. Whatever this is becoming, it has an expiration date built into the mission itself. Grace's warning stayed with me long after our conversation ended, a quiet, persistent worry that followed me through my regular duties and into my evening visits with Vesserai. I told myself she was right, that maintaining professional distance made sense, given everything at stake, that whatever strange connection had developed between us existed within the temporary, artificial confines of a rescue mission that would eventually conclude, one way or another, with her handed off to command and myself returning to routine patrol duty. I told myself this, and I believed it right up until the evening Vesserai asked me a question that shattered whatever careful distance I had been trying to maintain. Hart, she said, during what had become our usual evening conversation, her tone carrying an unusual hesitation I had not heard from her before. May I ask you something personal? Something outside the bounds of your medical duties? Of course. Among your people, what does it mean when someone chooses to spend their limited free hours with another, not out of obligation, but out of genuine preference for their company? The question hung in the air between us, simple on its surface and impossibly complicated underneath. I suppose it usually means they enjoy that person's company, I said carefully. That being around them feels good, feels right, in a way that's hard to explain. And if that feeling grows beyond simple enjoyment, into something more significant, more difficult to categorize. My pulse picked up despite my best efforts to remain composed. Then it might mean something more than friendship, I said, depending on the people involved. She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes studying me with an intensity that made the room feel smaller than its actual dimensions. Among the convergents, she finally said, queens do not experience such feelings toward individuals outside the hive, and certainly never toward members of another species entirely. It is considered, at best, an aberration, At worst, a fundamental corruption of what a queen is meant to be.
But,
I prompted, sensing there was more.
but I find myself experiencing precisely such a feeling,
She said, the admission clearly costing her something significant to voice aloud. Toward you, specifically, Hart. And I do not know what to do with that knowledge, given everything both our species have taught us to fear about the other. The weight of her words settled over me slowly, each piece clicking into place with a clarity that made my earlier attempts at denial feel foolish in retrospect. Ithra's warnings, Grace's concerns, the small moments I had been quietly cataloging without fully acknowledging their significance, all of it converged into a single, undeniable truth I could no longer avoid confronting. I don't know what to do with that either, I admitted honestly, but I don't think I want you to take it back. Her eyes widened slightly, an expression of surprise I had not seen from her before, followed quickly by something warmer, more vulnerable than the careful, calculated queen who had first walked aboard our ship weeks earlier. This complicates everything, she said quietly. Yeah, I agreed. It really does. Neither of us spoke for a long moment, sitting together in the dim light of her quarters, the weight of an admission neither species had prepared us to navigate, settling comfortably, unexpectedly, into the space between us. Outside, the Ashen Vow continued its careful course through contested space, carrying its impossible cargo, its complicated queen, and now, whatever this newly acknowledged connection between us was destined to become, further into the uncertain dark ahead. I left her quarters that night with far more questions than answers, and a growing certainty that whatever came next, professional distance was no longer a concept either of us could realistically maintain. I found the files by accident, or at least that is what I told myself afterward, though some part of me suspects I had been looking for answers longer than I wanted to admit. It happened 4 days after Vesserai's admission, during a routine data transfer between the medical bay archives and the ship's central computer. Owen had asked me to help troubleshoot a synchronization error affecting several departments, and in the process of tracing the problem through overlapping file directories, I stumbled across a classified folder buried 3 layers deep within Command's private archive, a folder labeled simply with Vesserai's designation code and a security clearance level well above my own. I should have closed it immediately. I did not. The first document was a summary report from Meridian Colony, dated nearly 9 years earlier, detailing the attack that had first cemented humanity's fear of the convergence. Casualties numbered in the thousands, the report included transcripts from survivors, testimony that painted a picture of methodical, deliberate destruction rather than the chaos of a spontaneous conflict. The second document made my stomach drop. It was a genealogical record, cross-referenced with convergent succession protocols, establishing Vesserai not merely as the queen who inherited the throne after the attack, but as the direct successor of the very ruler who had ordered it, groomed from an early stage in her development, specifically to continue her predecessor's expansionist policies. The report noted, in clinical, detached language, that intelligence suggested she had been present, in some capacity, during the planning stages of the attack itself, though direct evidence of her personal culpability remained inconclusive. The third document was the one that truly unsettled me. A directive, authorized at a command level far above Locke's authority, outlining contingency protocols should Vesserai's intelligence value prove insufficient to justify the political risk of keeping her alive. The language was careful, bureaucratic, the kind of phrasing designed to obscure its true meaning from anyone not already familiar with military euphemism, but the implication was unmistakable. If certain factions had their way, Vesserai would not be delivered to safety at all. She would be quietly eliminated, her death used to satisfy convergence loyalists and prevent further conflict, a sacrifice deemed acceptable in exchange for regional stability. I sat staring at that screen for a long time, my hands cold despite the ship's regulated temperature, trying to reconcile the woman I had come to know over the past weeks with the calculated portrait painted by these classified reports. Hart? Owen's voice pulled me back to the present. You all right? You've gone pale. Fine, I lied. Just tired. I'll finish the sync in a bit. I closed the files and left engineering without another word, my mind racing through implications I did not yet know how to process. Had she known I would eventually find this information? Had her admission of feeling toward me been genuine, or some calculated maneuver designed to secure protection from a species she understood better than any of us realized? I did not go to her quarters that evening. Instead, I found Grace in the officer's lounge, nursing a cup of the terrible synthetic coffee our replicators produced, and dropped into the seat across from her without preamble. "I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer," I said. Grace studied my expression and set down her cup. "This is about her, isn't it? I found classified files, her connection to Meridian Colony, Command's contingency plans if her intelligence isn't valuable enough to justify keeping her alive." Grace's jaw tightened, confirming what I already suspected. "You weren't supposed to see that." "But you knew." "Locke knew," she said. "I found out 2 days ago. It's why he's been pushing so hard to reach the outpost, before certain other parties catch up to us. He's trying to get her somewhere safe enough that Command can't quietly make this problem disappear." "And her connection to the attack itself? Was she actually involved?" Grace hesitated, clearly weighing how much to share. "The intelligence is inconclusive. She was young when it happened, still years from formal coronation. Some analysts believe she had no operational role in the planning. Others believe her training under the previous queen makes her complicit regardless of direct action. The truth is, Hart, nobody actually knows for certain, and that uncertainty is exactly why some factions want her eliminated, rather than risk the political fallout of putting her testimony on record." I sat with that information for a long moment, trying to reconcile it with everything Vesserai had shared with me over the past weeks. Her grief over the loss of Hive members she had never physically met, her genuine curiosity about human philosophy and individual choice, the vulnerable admission that had shattered whatever careful distance I thought I could maintain. "I need to talk to her," I finally said. "Be careful," Grace warned. "Whatever you feel for her, whatever she feels for you, none of that changes the political reality bearing down on this ship. If word reaches the wrong ears that you've compromised your objectivity regarding a high-value asset, with this much uncertainty surrounding her past, it puts both of you in danger, and possibly this entire crew along with you." I found Vesserai in her quarters, coiled in her usual resting posture, though something in the way her eyes tracked my entrance told me she immediately sensed the shift in my demeanor. "You have questions," she said, echoing words she had spoken to me during our very first private conversation weeks earlier. "I found the classified files," I said, deciding directness served us both better than careful diplomatic phrasing. "Meridian Colony, your connection to the attack, Command's contingency plans, if you're not deemed worth the political risk of keeping alive." Something shifted across her expression, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw genuine fear flicker behind those dark, faceted eyes. Fear that had nothing to do with pursuing warships or hostile factions, and everything to do with how I might now perceive her. "I did not order that attack," she said, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "I was young, still years from assuming direct control of the hive mind, but I was present during certain planning sessions, observing as part of my training under the queen who preceded me. I did not object. I did not fully understand, at the time, the scale of devastation being planned. That failure to object, that silence born of youth and inexperience, has haunted me every day since I assumed the throne, and understood, fully, what my predecessor's ambitions had cost your species." "Why didn't you tell me this yourself?" "Because I did not know how to voice a guilt that heavy, to someone whose species suffered so directly from decisions made in my presence," she said. "Because I feared, precisely as you now fear, that knowing the truth would change how you looked at me." "Has it changed," she asked, after a long silence stretched between us, "how you look at me?" I considered the question carefully, unwilling to offer false reassurance simply to ease the vulnerability evident in her posture. "I don't know yet," I admitted honestly. "I need time to think about what silence, at that age, in that position, actually means. But I don't think it erases everything else I've learned about who you are now." "That is more grace than I expected to receive," she said quietly. "There's something else," I continued, deciding she deserved full honesty, given everything else on the table. "Command has contingency plans. If your intelligence doesn't justify the political risk of protecting you, some factions want you eliminated rather than delivered safely." Locke is racing to reach the outpost before that decision gets made for him. Fear flickered across her expression again, though this time it settled into something more resolved, more accepting. The look of someone who had perhaps always suspected this possibility, even if she had not voiced it aloud. I have lived with the understanding that my life carries an expiration date since the moment I fled my own empire, she said. Whether that end comes from Convergence loyalists seeking to silence me, or from the very species I sought protection from, the outcome remains the same. It doesn't have to be the same, I said, surprising myself with the conviction in my own voice. Locke is trying to protect you. Grace, Nora, even Owen. This crew has put themselves at risk for weeks now to keep you alive. That has to count for something.
It counts for a great deal, she said softly.
More than you understand, perhaps, given how rarely my own people demonstrated such loyalty toward me, even during the height of my authority. We sat together in silence for a while after that, the weight of everything shared between us settling into something heavier, more complicated, but also, unexpectedly, more solid than before. Whatever guilt she carried regarding her silence during those early planning sessions, whatever uncertainty remained regarding her true culpability in an attack that had shaped an entire species' fear of her people, I found myself unable to simply discard the connection that had grown between us over these past weeks. There is something else you should know, she said eventually, her voice carrying a new note of hesitation. Among my people, the bond a queen forms when she chooses to trust an individual outside the hive carries consequences beyond simple personal risk. If my remaining loyalists, wherever they may have scattered to following the collapse, ever learn that I have formed such an attachment toward a human, toward the very species my empire once sought to conquer, they would consider it the deepest possible betrayal of everything a queen is meant to represent. What would they do? They would consider me fully compromised, she said, no longer worthy of the throne I once held, and perhaps, depending on how deeply that betrayal is perceived, no longer worthy of continued existence at all. The implications of her words settled over me slowly, adding yet another layer of danger to a situation that already carried more risk than I had fully appreciated. It was not simply Command's contingency plans we needed to navigate, or the hostile factions actively hunting her across contested space. It was also the possibility that whatever connection had grown between us, the very thing that made me want to protect her, could itself become the justification her enemies needed to finally succeed in eliminating her entirely. Then we keep it quiet, I said, until we figure out a way through this that doesn't put you at more risk than you're already facing. Can such things truly be kept quiet, Hart, once they have taken root? She asked, something almost sad in the question. I did not have a confident answer to give her, and we both understood, sitting together in that dim, carefully maintained room, that whatever secret we were now attempting to protect had already grown too significant to remain hidden indefinitely. Somewhere out in the dark beyond the Ashen Vow's hull, factions converged, loyalties shifted, and a clock neither of us could see continued counting down toward a confrontation neither of us felt fully prepared to face. But for that moment, at least, we chose to sit together in the quiet, drawing whatever comfort we could from each other's presence before the storm gathering around us finally broke. The attack came without warning, exactly the way Nora had always warned me it would. I was in the medical bay reviewing Ithra's recovery progress when the ship lurched violently, throwing me against the counter hard enough to knock the breath from my lungs. Alarms blared overhead, and Locke's voice cut through the chaos, tight with an urgency I had never heard from him before. All hands to battle stations. Multiple hostile contacts, converging fast. This is not a drill. I steadied myself against the wall and looked to Ithra, whose eyes had gone wide with an alertness that suggested she recognized something in the pattern of the attack that I did not. Convergence loyalists, she said grimly. I recognize the formation. They have found us. I did not wait for further explanation. I grabbed my emergency medical kit and ran for the bridge, weaving through crew, scrambling to their stations, the ship shuddering under what felt like sustained weapons fire against our shields. The bridge was a controlled storm of activity when I arrived, Locke barking orders while Grace coordinated defensive positioning, and Nora's voice crackled through comms, directing security teams throughout the ship. On the main view screen, I counted no fewer than 5 hostile vessels, their violet insignia unmistakable even at this distance, closing in formation that left little doubt about their intentions. "Shields at 40% and dropping," Owen reported from engineering. "They're not just trying to disable us, Captain. They're trying to breach the hull." "They want her," Locke said grimly, "and they're willing to destroy this entire ship to make sure nobody else gets to keep her alive." "Options?" Grace asked. "Jump drive is still 40 minutes from full charge," Owen replied. "We can't outrun them, and at this rate, we can't outlast them either." I felt the weight of the situation settling over the bridge like a physical presence, every officer understanding the same grim calculation. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time, with the fate of a woman I had come to care for deeply hanging in the balance of decisions being made in the space of seconds. "Get me a channel to their lead vessel," Locke ordered. "If they want to negotiate before this gets any worse, I want that option on the table." The channel opened, static crackling before resolving into a translated voice, cold and mechanical, utterly without the warmth or nuance I had come to associate with Vesserai's own layered speech patterns. "Human vessel, you harbor a traitor to the Convergence. Surrender the deposed queen, and your ship will be spared further engagement." Locke's expression hardened. "This vessel operates under the protection of the United Nations of Sol. We do not surrender passengers under threat, regardless of the political complications involved." "Then you will be destroyed alongside her," the voice replied, flat and final, before the channel cut abruptly. The attack intensified immediately, our shields groaning under sustained fire, as Nora's security teams scrambled to reinforce vulnerable sections of the hull. I felt the ship shudder repeatedly, each impact bringing us closer to a breach that could prove catastrophic for the entire crew. I made a decision then that I knew, even as I made it, would likely draw Grace's sharp disapproval, and possibly Locke's as well. I left the bridge and ran for Vesserai's quarters, driven by an instinct I could not fully articulate, beyond a certainty that she deserved to face whatever came next, with someone beside her rather than alone in a sealed room, while the ship fought for its survival around her. I found her standing, rather than resting in her usual coiled posture, her full height commanding the small space, in a way that reminded me, forcefully, of the imposing figure who had first walked through our airlock weeks earlier. "You should not be here," she said immediately. "This danger is mine to face, not yours. It stopped being just yours the moment this crew decided to protect you," I said. "That includes me." The ship shuddered again, harder this time, and the lights flickered momentarily, before emergency power stabilized them. Somewhere below decks I heard the distant, muffled sound of what might have been a hull breach being sealed. Crew members shouting instructions I could not fully make out. "They will not stop," Vesserai said quietly. "Not until I am dead, or until this entire ship is destroyed trying to protect me. I cannot allow that trade, Hart. Too many lives already weigh on my conscience." Understanding dawned with a cold certainty that settled deep in my chest. "You're thinking about surrendering yourself." "I am thinking about the crew that has shown me more genuine loyalty in these past weeks than my own hive demonstrated during the collapse of my empire," she said. "I will not let that loyalty become the reason for their destruction." "That's not your decision to make alone," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "This crew chose to protect you. Locke chose it. Grace, Nora, Owen, every single person on this ship made that choice knowing the risk involved. You don't get to throw that choice away just because you feel guilty about the cost." Something shifted in her expression, the calculated resolve wavering slightly under the weight of my words. Before she could respond, the comm system crackled to life with Grace's urgent voice. "Hart, get back to the bridge. Now. Something's happening you need to see." I hesitated, torn between the urgency in Grace's voice and my reluctance to leave Vesserai alone with whatever desperate decision she had been contemplating. "Go," she said quietly. "I will not act rashly, Hart, not without speaking with you again first." And I ran back to the bridge, my mind racing through possibilities, and arrived to find the tactical display showing something unexpected, a subset of the attacking vessels breaking formation, engaging each other rather than continuing their assault on the Ashen Vow. "What's happening?" I asked, breathless. "Best guess, internal conflict among the Loyalists," Grace said. studying the shifting formations with visible confusion. Two of their vessels just opened fire on a third. Ithra, who had insisted on being brought to the bridge despite her ongoing recovery, watched the display with an intensity that suggested she understood something the rest of us did not. "It is happening exactly as the Queen predicted it might," she said quietly. Without her direct guidance, the Loyalist faction has fractured into competing interests, each believing their own approach to eliminating her, or perhaps even using her as a bargaining chip with rival powers, represents the correct path forward. The hive without its queen begins consuming itself. The chaos among the attacking vessels bought us precious time, our shields recovering slightly as the sustained assault fragmented into a smaller, less coordinated engagement. Locke seized the opportunity immediately, ordering evasive maneuvers that put distance between the Ashen Vow and the worst of the confusion unfolding among our attackers. But the reprieve was temporary. Within minutes, the remaining coherent faction regrouped, their weapons once again targeting our vulnerable hull with renewed focus, apparently having resolved whatever internal dispute had briefly distracted them. "They're forming up again," Owen reported grimly. "Shields at 25%. We can't take another sustained assault like the last one." It was at that moment that Vesserai arrived on the bridge, her imposing presence drawing every eye, despite the chaos surrounding us. She moved directly to the communications station, addressing Locke with a formality that suggested she had made a decision I feared I already understood. "Captain, permit me to speak with them directly," she said. "Not to surrender, but to offer something that might fracture their unity permanently, rather than simply delaying the inevitable." Locke studied her for a long moment, weighing risk against the increasingly desperate tactical situation unfolding around us. "What exactly do you have in mind?" "The truth," she said simply, "about the succession crisis that fractured my empire, about the individuals among the Loyalist faction who orchestrated my exile for their own political gain, rather than any genuine concern for convergent stability. Information that, shared publicly across their communication networks, will turn faction against faction more effectively than any weapon your ship carries." "And the personal risk to you?" I asked, unable to stay silent. "Considerable," she admitted, meeting my eyes with a steadiness that spoke to a decision already firmly made. "But less than the risk this crew currently faces on my behalf. And I have decided, Hart, that I am done allowing others to bear costs. I am capable of addressing myself." Locke glanced at me, some unspoken question passing between us that I could not fully interpret in the urgency of the moment. Then he nodded, granting Vesserai access to the open channel connecting us to the attacking fleet. What followed was unlike anything I had witnessed during my time aboard the Ashen Vow, Vesserai's layered, musical voice carrying across the void with the authority I had glimpsed during our private conversations, but never seen deployed at this scale. She spoke of betrayal within her own court, named individuals responsible for orchestrating the very attack that had nearly killed her and Ithra weeks earlier, revealed financial and political motivations that painted the Loyalist faction's supposed devotion to convergent stability as nothing more than a convenient cover for personal ambition. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Within minutes, the tactical display showed the remaining coherent faction fracturing entirely, vessels breaking formation and turning weapons against each other, as accusations and counter-accusations apparently spread through channels we could not directly monitor. "It's working," Grace said, disbelief evident in her voice as she watched the chaos unfold across our sensors. Vesserai closed the channel and turned to face the bridge crew, exhaustion evident in her posture, despite the tactical victory she had just orchestrated. "It will not eliminate the threat entirely," she said. "But it will buy this ship considerably more time than we possessed moments ago." Locke studied her with an expression I had not seen from him before, something approaching genuine respect replacing the careful, professional distance he had maintained since her rescue weeks earlier. "That was either incredibly brave or incredibly reckless, Your Majesty." "Among my people," she said quietly, "the distinction between those two qualities has always been considerably thinner than most assume." As the immediate crisis subsided and the bridge crew returned to more routine monitoring of our surroundings, I found myself standing beside Vesserai, the weight of everything that had just transpired settling slowly between us. "You could have died delivering that message," I said quietly. "I could have watched this entire crew die protecting me instead," she replied. "I chose the risk I found more acceptable." "Don't do that again without talking to me first," I said, surprising myself with the intensity of the request. She studied me for a long moment, something warm and vulnerable passing across her expression, despite the exhaustion clearly weighing on her. "I made you a promise, Hart, that I would not act rashly without speaking with you first. I intend to honor that promise, though I recognize the circumstances required immediate action rather than extended deliberation." "Just be more careful," I said. "Please." "I will try," she said softly. "Though I suspect, given everything currently unfolding around this ship, careful may prove increasingly difficult to maintain in the days ahead." Neither of us knew, standing together on that bridge as the ashen vow limped away from the fractured remains of the Loyalist assault, exactly how prophetic those words would prove to be in the confrontation still waiting for us ahead. The outpost appeared on our long-range sensors 2 days later, a welcome sight after everything the ashen vow had endured getting there, though I understood, along with the rest of the senior staff, that reaching friendly territory did not automatically resolve the deeper complications still hanging over Vesserai's fate. "Command has been notified of our approach," Grace reported during our final briefing before docking. "They're sending a diplomatic team to receive her, along with representatives from 3 separate factions interested in the political fallout from her testimony." "Any word on which way Command is leaning?" Locke asked. "Protection, or the alternative Hart found buried in those classified files?" Grace's expression remained carefully neutral. "Officially, they haven't decided. Unofficially, the fracturing of the Loyalist faction has apparently shifted some opinions. A queen capable of dismantling her own enemies through information alone represents a valuable asset in ongoing negotiations across the Rim, provided she's willing to continue cooperating." I sat through the briefing with a growing knot of anxiety in my chest, understanding that whatever decision Command ultimately made regarding Vesserai's fate, it would happen largely outside my control, dictated by political calculations that cared little for the personal connection that had grown between us over these past weeks. I found her afterward in her quarters, staring at nothing in particular, an unusual stillness to her posture that suggested she had been contemplating the same uncertain future weighing on my own mind. "They will decide my fate within hours of our arrival," she said without preamble as I entered. "I have made peace with whatever outcome awaits me." "I haven't," I said honestly. "I'm not ready to just hand you over and hope for the best." She studied me carefully, something soft and sad passing across her expression. "Hart, regardless of what Command decides, my presence aboard this ship was always meant to be temporary. Even in the most favorable outcome, I will likely be relocated somewhere secure, my continued cooperation with your species' intelligence services becoming the primary focus of whatever remains of my existence." "That doesn't mean this has to end," I said, the words coming out with more conviction than I had realized I possessed. "Whatever happens with the politics, whatever Command decides about your testimony, I'm not walking away from what's grown between us, just because the mission technically concludes." Something shifted in her expression. Hope and fear tangled together in a way I had come to recognize as distinctly her own particular blend of vulnerability. "You would risk your career, perhaps your standing among your own people, to maintain a connection with someone your species has spent generations fearing." "I'd risk a lot more than that," I said. "You've become important to me, Vesserai. More important than I expected when this whole assignment started. I'm not interested in pretending otherwise, just because it's politically inconvenient." We docked at the outpost 3 hours later, and the reception waiting for us proved every bit as complicated as Grace had warned. Diplomatic representatives from multiple factions crowded the docking bay, their presence creating a tense, crowded atmosphere that made the careful intimacy of our private conversations aboard the Ashen Vow feel like a distant memory. Locke handled the initial negotiations with the practiced skill of someone who had spent decades navigating exactly this kind of political minefield, presenting Vesserai's cooperation, her role in fracturing the Loyalist faction, and the strategic value of her continued testimony as compelling arguments against the more extreme contingency plans still technically on the table. I watched from the periphery, forbidden from direct involvement in the formal negotiations but unable to simply walk away, while Vesserai's fate hung in careful balance, before a room full of officials weighing her worth against political convenience. The deliberations stretched across several tense hours, factions arguing amongst themselves about the appropriate handling of a deposed queen, whose testimony carried both significant value and significant risk. I caught fragments of the discussion as it unfolded, careful bureaucratic language obscuring decisions that would fundamentally alter Vesserai's future, and by extension, whatever future I had begun imagining alongside her. Finally, a senior diplomatic official approached Locke, Grace, and myself with a decision that, while not perfect, represented considerably more than the grim alternative I had feared since discovering those classified files. The former queen will be granted protected status, the official announced, on the condition of continued cooperation regarding convergence intelligence and ongoing diplomatic efforts to stabilize the region. She will be relocated to a secure facility, though given the unusual circumstances of her rescue and the demonstrated trust established during transport, Captain Locke has successfully petitioned for continued limited contact with designated crew members from the Ashen Vow, including yourself, Medical Officer Hart, given your established role in her care and cooperation. Relief flooded through me with an intensity that nearly buckled my knees, and beside me, I felt rather than saw Vesserai's careful composure finally crack into something approaching genuine hope. Continued limited contact, I repeated, testing the phrase for any hidden qualifications that might undermine its apparent promise. Correct, the official confirmed. The specifics will require formal documentation, but the framework exists for ongoing relationship maintenance, subject to appropriate security protocols and continued value assessment of the former Queen's cooperation. It was not everything I might have hoped for, bureaucratic language and security protocols still governing whatever future connection Vesserai and I might build together, but it was infinitely more than the alternative I had feared, and considerably more than either of us had any right to expect given the impossible circumstances that had brought us together in the first place. Later that evening, as the Ashen Vow prepared for departure, and Vesserai prepared for transfer to her new, secure accommodations aboard the outpost, I found a few precious minutes alone with her before the formal transfer proceedings began.
"You did this,"
she said quietly. "Whatever influence secured this outcome, I suspect your voice played some role in the negotiations, regardless of your formal exclusion from the proceedings." "Locke and Grace did the heavy lifting," I said. "But yeah, I made sure they understood exactly what was at stake, professionally and personally." "Personally," she repeated, something warm settling into the word. "You are willing to risk your career, your standing, perhaps your very reputation among your own species, to maintain whatever this has become between us." "I already told you that," I said. "I meant it then, and I mean it now." She studied me for a long moment, the careful, calculating queen who had first walked through our airlock weeks earlier, finally giving way entirely to something softer, more genuine, more unmistakably her own particular version of vulnerable affection. "Among my people," she said, "there exists no word for what has grown between us. Human and queen, healer and monarch, two individuals from species that spent generations fearing and misunderstanding each other, finding something worth protecting, despite every reason to remain guarded. Maybe we don't need a word for it," I said. "Maybe it's enough that it exists, regardless of what anyone calls it." "Perhaps," she agreed, something that might have been genuine happiness touching the edges of her expression. "Though I suspect, Hart, that whatever the galaxy eventually decides to call this connection between us, it will find the reality considerably more complicated and considerably more genuine than any simple label could adequately capture." The formal transfer proceedings began shortly after, Vesserai escorted from the Ashen Vow toward her new, secure accommodations with the same careful, measured dignity she had carried since the moment she first arrived aboard our ship. Ithra accompanied her, fully recovered now, her loyalty to her queen undiminished, despite everything both of them had endured during these past weeks of uncertainty and danger. I stood at the docking bay entrance, watching them depart, understanding that whatever came next, the careful diplomatic framework securing our continued contact, would require patience, persistence, and considerable navigation of bureaucratic complexity neither of us had fully anticipated when this impossible connection first began forming. But as Vesserai paused at the threshold, turning back briefly to meet my eyes across the crowded docking bay. I understood with complete certainty that whatever challenges awaited us, whatever political complications continued to shadow her uncertain future, the connection we had built together aboard the Ashen Vow represented something worth protecting, worth fighting for, regardless of the considerable obstacles still standing between us. The galaxy had spent generations fearing humanity's capacity for restraint, mistaking mercy for weakness, and compassion for calculation. Perhaps, I thought, watching Vesserai disappear through the security checkpoint toward her uncertain new future, that same misunderstood capacity for genuine connection, for choosing loyalty and care over fear and suspicion, represented humanity's most powerful quality of all. Not a nightmare born from cruelty or devastating force, but something considerably more unsettling to those who had spent so long defining themselves through conquest and control. A species capable of looking past every reason for fear and finding, instead, something worth genuine connection. The Ashen Vow departed the outpost hours later, resuming its patrol duties along the contested rim, carrying a crew forever changed by the impossible cargo they had once rescued from certain destruction. And somewhere behind us, in a secure facility slowly becoming her new home, a former queen continued navigating her own uncertain future, carrying with her the knowledge that whatever the galaxy ultimately decided about her fate, she was no longer facing that uncertainty alone. Some connections, I had learned, transcended the careful boundaries species built between each other, out of fear and misunderstanding. Some bonds proved stronger than politics, stronger than reputation, stronger even than the vast, impossible distances separating one species from another across the endless dark of space. And some secrets, once finally spoken aloud, changed everything that followed, for better and for good.